Thank you all for being here. We'll start in just a few moments, okay? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on wildfire resilient communities. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. In addition, due to the broad interest in today's hearing, I would like to ask unanimous consent that all interested members be allowed to join us and participate on the dais. Thank you all for being here today and for the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands hearing on the importance of wildfire resilient communities. I'd also like to welcome our panel. My hope today is that we can recognize the important steps Congress has already taken to fund fire suppression and forest management with the passage of the fiscal year 2018 Omnibus Appropriations Bill and that the recently enacted Farm Bill. These recent congressional actions on fire funding and forest management provide us with an opportunity to revisit the drivers behind recent devastating wildfires. Our responsibility as members of Congress is to ensure that limited federal resources are being spent wisely and that they are matched to the needs of the communities we are here to serve. This is especially true with wildfires. Wildfires have always burned across the American landscape, forests, grasslands, and chaparral alike, long before there were any federal, state, or governmental lines. Many Native American tribes recognized that wildfire was a natural and necessary process to help shape healthy and diverse ecosystems. Many indigenous communities use wildfires as a tool, burning preemptively to help protect their communities and maintain the land for subsistence uses. Today, land use changes and significantly more development in fire-prone areas have placed millions of Americans at risk. Meanwhile, climate change is contributing to higher temperatures, drier conditions, insect and disease outbreaks, and longer fire seasons to the point that wildfire is now a year-round concern. A century of unsustainable logging and fire suppression have proven that we cannot simply cut our way out of wildfire risk. In extremely hot, dry, windy conditions, a strong blown ember can place entire communities in harm's way. This is why community-focused solutions will always be our best defense against devastating wildfires. No one on this subcommittee opposes active management, but too often this term is co-opted to call for rolling back environmental protections, limiting public input, and restricting judicial review without any meaningful benefits to community safety or forest health. We are here today to talk about community-focused solutions like better land use planning, fire-resilient home construction, and ecological and science-based forest restoration and fuels management. This approach allows us to retain the integrity of our public lands while supporting healthy forests, rural economies, well-paying jobs, firefighter safety, and community resiliency in the face of a changing climate. Many wildfires can negatively impact public health, clean water, and recreational opportunities, but the most effective thing we can do to protect human lives and property is to work within our communities. In the U.S. last year, there were over 58,000 wildfires that burned 8.8 million acres. We have a world-class interagency fire response and command system that is typically able to suppress or contain more than 95% of wildfires. For the small percentage of wildfires that do get out of control, building more resilient communities is the only way we can prevent wildland fires from becoming an urban catastrophe. If we can take a moment today to stop thinking from the forest in and start thinking from the home out, I believe we will find a lot of consensus in this room. To my constituents in New Mexico who have felt the impacts of wildfire as much as nearly anyone in the country, I want to say that I'm doing all I can to fight climate change, protect clean drinking water, and support the policies and resources we need to better prepare our communities for wildfire. However, we must also take steps as individuals and as a community to ensure the resiliency of our homes and the safety of our families. Our witnesses today will provide some of these valuable perspectives, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. Thank you again to the witnesses and to all of you for being here today. I would now like to recognize the ranking minority member, Mr. Curtis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank my Democratic friends for convening this hearing to discuss our growing national wildfire crisis. After a historically tragic fire year, House Republicans, especially those on this committee, have been urging our friends on the other side of the aisle, dais, to take action on this dire issue. I'm pleased that we're doing so here today. The poor health of our nation's forest has reached crisis levels before our own eyes. We've seen many of our nation's once flourishing forests transform into dead and burned out wastelands. 2018 was an especially deadly and destructive year. Wildfires destroyed over 8.8 million acres across the United States. In my home state of Utah alone, nearly 500,000 acres burned last year. Over 60% of Utah is federal land, adding even more unique challenges to our forest management. Tragically, wildfires have also claimed the lives of over 400 Americans in the last 20 years. Just last year, an especially deadly fire in California killed 85 people. The poor state of many federal forests is an undeniable national emergency. For decades, we've failed to properly manage our forest, which has led to hazardous fuels buildup. As a result, these excessive fuels loads are increasing the likelihood of deadly fires. We cannot continue to ignore the forest health crisis. The federal government's current rate, treating a mere 2% of the nearly 80 million acres identified as high risk to wildfires, is not acceptable. Litigation and endless analysis force federal lands management to spend 40% of their time and money on bureaucratic processes and bulletproofing against the fear of litigation instead of getting real work done on the ground. This is a very real problem, and we must enact measures to increase the pace and scale of active management across our forest lands. This Congress presents a new opportunity for Congress to enact meaningful reforms to bring relief to our western communities. It is vital that we empower land management agencies with the tools they need to restore health and resiliency to our forest, while also finding ways to make our rural communities safer from the threat of catastrophic wildfires. There are some who unfortunately dismiss or downplay the need for better forest management. They argue that efforts would be better served focusing solely on community protection tools like fire-resistant construction and defensible spaces. While these are very important public safety tools, they do not negate the need for more proactive management of our forest. They go hand in hand. While I'm excited to work on important community safety efforts, I must also urge my colleagues to not neglect our responsibility to address the failing health of our nation's forest. For too long, we've focused on fire suppression while ignoring the need to address fire prevention. Year after year, our national wildfire crisis continues to grow. Toward that end, yesterday I was proud to join my good friend and Congressman Westerman in introducing the Resilient Federal Forest Act. I believe this bill provides the types of fire prevention tools needed to restore health to our nation's forest, while also empowering important community safety efforts. This proposal builds on Congressman Westerman's House-passed legislation from the 115th Congress and provides real reforms that will help our land management prevent catastrophic wildfires and stop the horrible tragedies that we are seeing in the West year after year. I urge my colleagues to join us in this effort. With that, Madam Chair, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing their testimonies. I yield my time.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Curtis. Now we will turn to our panel. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left and red when the time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. The chair now recognizes Dr. Ray Rasker, Executive Director of Headwater Economics. Mr. Rasker, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Holland and Ranking Member Curtis and members of the committee. I'm pleased to join you today to talk about how land use planning promotes wildfire-resistant communities. I'm the Executive Director of Headwaters Economics. We're an independent nonprofit research group based in Montana. We work all over the country, and we work to improve community development and land management decisions. I'm here to share with you what we've learned through our Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program. To date, we've worked with communities throughout the U.S. to help them improve their land use planning practices with the goal of reducing wildfire risk. Let me start with giving a few examples of what we mean by land use planning. By this, we mean regulations and incentives that are applied by local governments and their planning departments in collaboration with their fire departments. Examples include landscape regulations that require property owners to manage hazardous vegetation, building codes that require the use of wildfire-resistant building materials on new homes, subdivision design standards for minimum road widths, secondary access, and adequate water supply, and incentives to encourage development in areas with lower wildfire risk. So these are just some of the examples of what we mean by improved land use planning. The reason we focus on land use planning is because the wildland-urban interface, which is the area where the built environment mixes with flammable natural vegetation, is now the most common form of development in the U.S. From 1990 to 2010, 43% of new homes were built in the wildland-urban interface, and currently more than a third of all the homes in the U.S. are on these flammable lands. So wildfires today kill more people and destroy more property and cost more to fight than ever before. On average, the federal agencies are spending over $3 billion per year to fight wildfires, and one of the reasons that wildfires have become more expensive to fight is due to the high cost of defending an increasing number of homes. Estimates of the cost of defending homes vary from a low of 30% to a total of 50 to sometimes 95% of the cost of a fire. And some fires in Northern California, the cost of defending homes can range as high as $400,000 to $600,000 per home. So where we build, how we build, and under what conditions we permit development, these are the key determinants of whether we'll be able to control the rising costs, dangers, and damages from wildfire. Reducing wildfire risk to communities is largely a question of reducing the chances that homes and other structures will catch on fire. Post-fire analysis and laboratory research have proven that the area immediately around the home and the home itself are the primary determinants of wildfire survival. The most effective way to survive a wildfire is to put in place regulations, and importantly, the enforcement of regulations that increase a community's chances of surviving a wildfire. Let me explain how the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program works. Every year, communities apply to be part of the program. The application is submitted by a diverse group that includes the planning department, the fire department, and elected officials. When a community is selected, we sign an MOU with local government that spells out that the services that we provide are free and that the recommendations we deliver are voluntary. When a community is selected to participate in the program, they receive 4 areas of assistance. We review their planning documents, such as the County Comprehensive Plan, the Hazard Mitigation Plan, development codes and ordinances, and we offer advice on how to strengthen these on reducing wildfire risk. Some communities also receive detailed neighborhood-scale hazard mapping. We offer training programs to increase the capacity of local planning staff, and we provide custom research support. For example, research we conducted recently with Dr. Quarles documents how building a home to wildfire-resistant standards costs about the same as traditional construction. To date, we've worked with more than 30 communities. 9 have received wildfire hazard assessments, and more than 700 planners, fire personnel, elected officials, and others have participated in the training programs. Allow me to end with a description of what we're hearing from the community leaders. They need help with land use planning. Their planning staff, if they have them at all, are already overworked and they're not experts in wildfire. When we offer free assistance and expertise, we help them accomplish something that they couldn't do by themselves. Communities also need easy access to neighborhood-scale wildfire hazard maps. Planning and fire departments use these to encourage and incentivize development in places that are safe, and they use the same maps to identify areas of high risk where development, if it proceeds, is done with the latest science on how to build to wildfire-resistant standards. The wildfire problem will get worse. People are going to continue to build in harm's way, and we're not suggesting that we stop development.
Mr. Rasker, thank you so much. Your time has expired.
Okay.
We'll probably get to more of that during the question. Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Huffman for 30 seconds to introduce Dr. Steve Quarles.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to see a resident of my beautiful congressional district on the panel today. Dr. Steve Quarles is from Mill Valley. He is a University of California Cooperative Extension Advisor Emeritus, and also the retired chief scientist for the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. He has spent his entire career working to develop the science and expertise to help keep our communities safe. And he hails from the North Bay, where this issue is truly close to home. In fact, in his hometown in Mill Valley, the fire chief is one of hundreds of North Bay families who lost his home in the North Bay firestorm of 2017. So welcome, Dr. Quarles.
Thank you very much. You can go to the next slide. During a wildfire, most homes are ignited by wind-blown embers and not the wildfire front or a wall of flames, as many people may envision. I forgot to thank, Chairwoman Holland and the Ranking Member Curtis for inviting me here today. In this photograph, you will note that this home, located in South Lake Tahoe, California, and destroyed during the 2007 Angora fire, has unburned vegetation around it. This provides evidence that the wildland fire did not burn directly to the home, but rather embers generated from the fire's ignited combustible materials landing either on, near, or in the home. In the last several years, several fast-moving, wind-driven wildfires have occurred. Examples you will likely remember include the 2012 Waldo Canyon fire in Colorado, the 2016 Chimney Tops 2 fire in eastern Tennessee, and the 2017 and 18 fires in California. Wind-blown embers are important because of what they can do directly. They can ignite, for example, wood shake roof or wood deck, or they can ignite things indirectly, for example, igniting bark mulch or a wood pile located near or next to the home. Ignition of these items would in turn result in either flames contacting the home or radiant heat exposure impacting the home, both of which can result in ignition of the home. During a wildfire, the homeowner has likely been evacuated, and firefighters are involved with many life safety and suppression activities. It is unreasonable to expect firefighters to suppress every home that ignites. The home must be able to survive without intervention. This slide from a recent demonstration conducted at the IBHS Research Center located in Richburg, South Carolina. A duplex that you see here was built to compare traditional combustible building and landscaping materials applied on the left end of the duplex to fire-resistant building and landscaping materials applied to the right end of the duplex. The entire duplex was subjected to wind-blown embers generated by equipment located in the test chamber at IBHS. You will note that the left end of the duplex is burning and the right end isn't. Here is what happened after the duplex was exposed to the wind-blown embers. The embers ignited wood mulch on the left end of the duplex. Flames from the burning mulch ignited other vegetation adjacent to the building. Both of these ignited the siding. Once ignited, flames from the burning siding spread vertically up and laterally across to the window and gable end vent. You can't see the vent in this picture, but it's located just under the ridge of the roof, and to the area immediately under the roof line. Flames ultimately entered the attic space. All of this happened within 10 minutes of the wood mulch igniting. On the right end of the duplex, embers found nothing to ignite. Non-combustible rock mulch and fiber cement siding did not ignite. Both of these are important parts of a wildfire-resistant home. Homes built with materials and design features used on the right end of the duplex are far more wildfire-resistant. The next slide shows a real-life example from the 2018 Campfire in Paradise, California. The home on the left was ultimately completely destroyed. It's difficult to say exactly what the vulnerability of this building was, or this home was, but clearly it did not use enough wildfire-resistant materials or features. The home on the right survived and had many wildfire-resistant construction and landscaping materials as part of the construction. Many of them are included in Chapter 7A of the California Building Code, including a Class A fire-rated roof covering, non-combustible siding, and flame and ember-resistant vents. Use of rock mulch next to the home and incorporating several inches of a non-combustible material between the ground and the start of siding went beyond the language in the current version of the building code. Communities using such wildfire-related building codes can reduce their wildfire risk. As a researcher, I can say that we definitely know more about the vulnerabilities of homes and buildings and associated mitigation strategies than we did 10 years ago, and we are collectively working hard to improve building codes and test standards. If you go to the next slide. As you can see in this slide, vegetation management is also important. The goal of managing vegetation and other combustibles on the property is to make it difficult for the wildland fire to burn to the building. To summarize, home survival depends on a coupled approach where both vegetation and other combustible materials on the property are carefully selected, located, and maintained, and construction materials and their design and installation features are also. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quarles. The chair now recognizes Mr. Marco Bay, Executive Director of the Lomacatsi Restoration Project. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Madam Chairman, Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to share successful examples and community-based approaches that offer solutions for fostering wildfire-resilient communities. My testimony today focuses on a forward-thinking, replicable model that balances ecology and economy, holistically reduces wildfire risks through an ecological approach, advances climate adaptation, and addresses the socioeconomic challenges faced by forest-based communities. This solution is a practical approach, a holistic approach, and it's accomplished through authorities granted by the Congress, subcommittees, and the Stewardship Authority has been a successful model of layering in this ability to create resilient fire communities. We're working across 7 stewardship agreements in partnership with the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, with our tribal partners. And thank you, Madam Chairman, for recognizing Aboriginal fire as a really holistic approach to being in a fire-resilient community and creating a model for a place-based way to live with fire. What was expressed earlier, we live in a fire-adapted landscape. Fire will continue to come, and we are preparing right now for this coming summer. So looking at these approaches, one project I'll start with is the Ashland Forest Resiliency Stewardship Project in the town of Ashland in Southern Oregon. We have an elected official here from the City Council. That project has accomplished 10,000 acres in a municipal watershed. 14 million board feet have been removed with support of the community. We've recaptured $6 million of retained receipts that get reinvested back into prescribed fire and additional service work. That project is a model and has influenced other projects across California and Oregon in regions 5 and 6. Just over the hill from that, the Klamath Tribal Ecosystem Partnership Program has implemented to date 40,000 acres of treatment through Stewardship Authority, recaptured close to $2 million from profit reinvestment from byproduct sales, implementing an ICO methodology, individuals, clumps, and openings. So trying to create spatial arrangements in a holistic way, how the landscape would burn in a mosaic. This is implemented by tribal members, doing the pre-sale work through this stewardship agreement in an ecological fashion based on the Klamath Tribe's forest plan, and recapturing that profit reinvestment to go back into additional restoration work across 48,000 acres. So right now we're looking at about 25 million acres that are in agreement across the 2 regions, and up to date we've implemented 60,000 of those acres. And obviously we agreed that we do have to increase the pace and scale, but how do we do that? How do we live within the fire environment and not create additional problems? As somebody who installed a lot of the tree plantations in the 80s and 90s, working in the reforestation era, we know those fires burn really hot. We know there's a lot of infill of vegetation that needs treatment. So we want to create that resiliency. We want to create that economic opportunity, but we want to do that without creating additional problems that are going to exacerbate the fire issue. So through these models, we've advanced this to Region 5 in California, partnership with the Karuk tribe, who are leading the way in a place-based management strategy. So from the execution of NEPA preparation and zones of agreement through collaborative work, the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership is one example. that has worked with the tribe and the Forest Service and 20 community organizations to get about 6,000 acres off the ground. And we'll have about 6 million board feet coming out of there through that ICO method, and employing tribal members in the local community, employing local loggers, and moving in that place-based, forward-thinking way of getting work done collaboratively. So collaboratives offer a huge amount of capacity to get these projects off the ground, zones of agreement. To advance this further, back in the Rogue Basin with the Ashland project, we've had 10,000 acres implemented. Now we want to expand this across 1 million acres in the Rogue Basin using risk assessments, science and forest-based risk assessments. And we're looking at about 1 million acres of that 4 million acre landscape that needs treatment through the Forest Restoration Initiative. In order to do that, it's going to take a significant investment, but there'll be some recapture from those retained receipts. We're looking at 35,000 acres a year that need treatment, a $30 million investment over time to create that resilient landscape, using that model, layering in youth training and employment programs, layering in workforce development programs, incubating local businesses, private sector businesses, keeping our service providers and timber operators afloat so we can continue to increase the pace and scale and restore resiliency.
Thank you so much. The chair now recognizes Ms. Patty Hiromi, Acting Deputy Chief for State and Private Forestry at the U.S. Forest Service. Welcome, and you have 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Patty Hiromi. I am Acting Deputy Chief for the USDA Forest Service. Thank you for the opportunity to share what the Forest Service and our partners are doing to help communities prepare for wildland fire. Last month, I too was at the in Paradise, California. There are no words to describe the devastation caused by the 2018 Campfire. While damaging wildfire is often associated with the West, it is not just a Western issue. Many of you recall the tragic fires in Gatlinburg, Tennessee in 2016. In my profession, I understand under the wrong conditions, this could happen anywhere. The Forest Service is committed to helping communities become more resilient to wildfire. This involves a spectrum of activities, ranging from fire prevention to planning, tools, to help communities better live with fire, as well as managing overgrown forests and treating hazardous fuels in the wildland-urban interface. It takes all these activities, not any one program or any organization alone. The Forest Service works with many partners to implement each of these activities. You will hear about some of these partnerships today. The Forest Service estimates nearly 80 million acres are at risk from uncharacteristically severe wildfires. Research shows that by actively managing fire-dependent landscapes and reducing hazardous fuels, we can lower the frequency and impact of wildfires and provide for safer firefighting conditions. The Forest Service continues to focus on reducing wildfire risk through prescribed burns, timber sales, and mechanical treatments to reduce spread and severity of wildfire and then promote resilient ecosystems. We have reviewed the fuels treatments, our fuels treatments, and found that 86% were effective in changing fire behavior, helping to suppress wildfire, or making conditions safer for firefighters. Through Secretary Perdue's vision for shared stewardship, we are engaging with tribes, states, fire associations, local governments, and partner organizations in landscape-level work to reduce wildfire risk. States are uniquely positioned to convene stakeholders to work together and prioritize investments to address these risks. The Forest Service is capitalizing on the authorities created by last year's omnibus and farm bills. We will use all active management tools, including the right kind of fire at the right place at the right time. The Forest Service supports innovative breakthrough approaches that promote healthy forests and healthy, prosperous communities. This is another part of the spectrum of our activities to reduce risk to communities. Our partners here today are sharing that work with you. Humans cause nearly 90% of wildfires, including those that are most costly. Through partnerships with the International Association of Fire Chiefs and others, the Forest Service delivers public information on ways to prevent or reduce impact from human-caused fires and how to evacuate safely. The nation's biggest advocate for wildfire prevention, of course, is Smokey Bear. Smokey turned 75 this year, and Smokey remains the heart of the longest-running public service campaign in America's history. Smokey's messages are particularly important as people choose to recreate and live in the wildland-urban interface. The National Association of State Foresters identified more than 70,000 communities at risk from wildfire. The Forest Service assists state foresters and local communities by building capacity for fire prevention, preparedness, mitigation, and suppression. This is particularly important as local fire departments or state agencies are the first responders on 75% of wildfires. Like many, I fought fire during the summer to put myself through school. I spent decades as a firefighter, as a Type 1 burn boss, and as a manager of large complex fires. I have come to learn that everyone, homeowners, landowners, all levels of government, tribal governments, and partner organizations, we all want the same thing: healthy forests and resilient communities. As identified by the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Strategy, each of us plays a role in making a difference. This concludes my remarks. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. McClintock for 30 seconds to introduce Mr. Brian Veerkamp.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It is my pleasure to introduce El Dorado County Supervisor Brian Veerkamp. Supervisor Veerkamp is a descendant of one of the original pioneering families of El Dorado County. Recently retired after 31 years of service in the public emergency services, culminating with his tenure as fire chief of the El Dorado Hills Fire Department. He is at ground zero of this issue, and I've come over the years to depend upon his advice and counsel on these matters, and very pleased to present him to the committee today.
Members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to share with you my thoughts and observations and some recommendations on this important topic. Being an elected official myself, I have nothing but respect for all you do in your service to our country. As Mr. McClintock pointed out, I'm a fifth-generation Northern California resident descending from the two pioneer families that came for the gold rush. Both families quickly turned to ranching after arriving, raising crops along with cattle for approximately 150 years. They utilized lower elevations for their homestead ranches and mountain meadow pastures in the summers via private property and grazing permits. After 31 years in the fire and emergency services field, I had the opportunity to design fire-resilient communities, serve on a statewide incident management team, and develop codes and ordinances to serve and protect the public. On the incident management team, we assisted local jurisdictions by managing the large-scale incidents when requested. These took place throughout California and occasionally other states, Idaho, Montana, and Louisiana, to name a few. During that career as well, I had many opportunities to observe, unfortunately, catastrophic wildfires and study after-action reports for commonalities. Also, during my life experiences and observations in Northern California, I've witnessed our rural, wildland-urban interface and forests become overridden with excessive brush, dead and dying debris, hundreds of trees per acre, etc. I'm also an avid outdoors person, frequenting Idaho, Montana, most of the western states, and certainly California, and the same conditions obviously exist. In my younger years, these backwood trips and mountainous excursions led me to observe that vegetation and its status, which was way more managed then. Today it's so thick and overgrown you can't even walk through it to try to access streams or trails. Cattle grazing is not prevalent. Forest management practices have been greatly declined. Timber is imported while our resources either rot or burn, and our rural communities are at all-time risk of being destroyed by massive wildfire. In El Dorado County, where I live, I've had and experienced over the last 10 years numerous catastrophic fires, the Angora, King, Sand, American, to name a few. These fires burnt with unprecedented extreme intensity, consuming hundreds of thousands of acres, hundreds of homes lost, damaging expensive watersheds, and ruining the local environment for years to come. Animal, reptile, amphibian, plant habitat have been greatly altered severely in these fire areas from beyond any other means of devastation we could impose upon them. Studies have verified this along with my direct observations. Some of the watershed damage due to ground sterilization continues to be a constant erosion problem year after year, contaminating our drinking water supplies and making expensive cleanup. Protected amphibians have failed to return due to the unattainable conditions and habitat. Finally, studies now confirm that the smoke from these fires severely damages our climate and way more than the preventive controlled fires or vegetation forest management practices and vehicles combined. The solutions, as I experienced these things throughout my life and career, I would often ask my grandfather, who lived to be 101 years old, who frequented the mountains in the summer with his cattle, lived on the family ranches at lower elevations, what created good, safe environments, healthy forests, protections from wildfires? His answer was simple: manage the land or it'll manage you. His generation learned from the Native Americans and others to use fire as a tool, girdle invasive trees while young, graze animals, harvest timber, and minimize risk from fire by modifying vegetation and create buffers from what you don't want to burn. Irrigation and plentiful water was also a great asset. There are numerous writings on these topics to confirm these actions and prove they work. The problem in these tactics is they don't make the major headlines. They would sure work and save everyone plenty of money and losses. We've created an acceptance for these catastrophic events, even memorialized them when people lose their lives as a result. Also, they've become quite profitable for many. It's time we turn the tables on this issue and put the money and efforts on preventive management. This practice may take hard work, but it's much more devastating, much less devastating to our environment than the massive wildfire. So 6.5 years ago, I was elected to serve on our county board of supervisors, and we've been working very hard, I have a fellow supervisor here today as well, to institute good practices in our area. And part of that fire resilient community practice is adopting a mandatory fire resilient community vegetation management program. It's a countywide ordinance that'll now take effect that also involves the landowner. Being a landowner is a responsibility, and they as well will be responsible to clean up that land, or we will do it for them and assess them for that. We can no longer let these catastrophic fires impact our communities as they do. So thank you again very much for this opportunity, and I'm very open to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that valuable testimony. I appreciate all of you being here. We will now turn to the question period, and I will recognize Mr. Gallego for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here. In Arizona, we know better than most how climate change, drought conditions, forest mismanagement, and other factors have put communities at risk of catastrophic wildfire. Ms. Hiromi, did I say that correctly? Hiromi? No, hey, people mess up my last name all the time, so I want to give you that respect too. Is it Hiromi? Okay, so I apologize. Ms. Hiromi, in your testimony, you mentioned the Shared Stewardship Program, and I wanted to take a moment to recognize the leadership in Arizona and the efforts they've taken to actively and effectively manage our forests. Arizona's Forest Restoration Initiative, also known as FORFRI, serves as a model for how we can tackle forest management and resiliency at a state level. As part of our FORFRI, the Regional Forest Service has come together with dozens of state and local stakeholders, groups including local governments, the Salt River Project, scientists from universities and conservation groups, and national environmental groups. Together, they're working on a science-based solution to help promote effective forest management, prevent catastrophic fire, and preserve an extremely important watershed for my constituents in Phoenix. Like many of our witnesses have stated, I believe we must put science and public health and safety at the forefront of fire prevention efforts. And I'm encouraged by the efforts of those involved in the FORFRI program to do just that. So moving on to some of my questions. Mr. Marco, in your testimony, you state that millions of acres of public and private forest lands urgently require ecologically based treatment to reduce fuel loads, improve watershed health, and bolster resiliency so they can continue to provide vital ecosystem services for our communities. Can you expand on how best to differentiate ecologically based treatments versus treatments that may be more profitable for industry but less effective for forest management? Yep, thank you.
Would you like me to address that now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier in the testimony, that spatial heterogeneity, looking at the landscape, the way the mosaic would burn through fire. We're trying to replicate that through these best practices. So what that entails is retaining the architecture, the large old trees that are fire resilient, hanging on to those large trees, hanging on to that clumpy, patchy pattern while still implementing sometimes even aggressive thinning around those large trees in an ecological fashion through a method we call ICO. So that's individuals, clumps, and openings. And it ties very well to the use of aboriginal fire and some of those spatial patterning of anthropogenic burning, working closely with our tribal partners. Behind me, I have representatives of the Intertribal Ecosystem Restoration Partnership, elected tribal officials, who are putting this type of treatment on the ground using Western science, forest science, and traditional ecological knowledge to accomplish that work, while still reducing and removing volume that can go to local mills. As I mentioned earlier in the, around the Klamath tribal initiative in the Fremont-Wainema National Forest, where we've removed over 24 million board feet, we've done that as the byproducts of ecological forestry, not the driver, but there still is an opportunity to support our local mills in an ecological way, get logs to those communities, employ the timber community, and utilize that best practice ecological forestry approach. What we spoke about earlier was that homogeneous type management, even age management, or less complex management is what we want to move away from. I think those stands will burn a lot hotter. We've seen that, and creating more slash on the ground through outdated forestry practices, monoculture plantations. I know proposed clear cuts are not on the federal landscape these days, but we do have that on adjacent industrial lands. But a way to influence good forest practices while still generating that volume using best science and multi-party monitoring for the long term, because we're figuring out what we're doing. We've inherited this fire-adapted landscape. We're all pretty new to this extreme fire behavior that's increasing. So looking at a way that we can not continue to exacerbate that problem, restore ecological resilience, and not just trees, but understory vegetation, cultural plants for our tribal partners, and resilient communities. I think there's a win-win in this situation, and we've seen it demonstrated over the last 15 years on our projects, and continue to learn by doing with qualitative and quantitative assessments of this work. So the ecological approach tries to replicate that natural process and that natural condition on the landscape, and it's a win-win in the sense that we still are going to provide material to mills, biomass, and keep our communities employed, keep those rural communities working. Very important.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bay. I yield my time back.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Curtis, and I should have said Committee Rule 3D. Each member has 5 minutes, and so thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Last year, the Pole Creek Fire and the Bald Mountain Fire burned thousands, tens of thousands of acres in my district and near my home. I think if we were to ask the local residents and local elected officials, they would give us poor grades on how those lands were managed beforehand. Although quick to recognize the local federal employees in BLM and Forest Service work very hard, simply don't have the resources and the policies to manage those well. I think they would give us extremely high grades in how we fought that fire once it started. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and the resources that were put into that fire were truly amazing. We all wish we had the money spent on those resources for prevention before the fire started, but not the case. I think they'd also give us poor marks on response after the fire. We've got a community there who now is looking at the potential of massive mudslides coming down into the communities. And the answer that they hear are, we'll come help you once those mudslides occur, respond to that emergency, but we won't help you prevent those mudslides from the fire that we could have prevented. And that's not necessarily the topic of our hearing today, but I would like to express that frustration on the part of my residents that we just don't have the policies in place and the resources in place in USDA's disaster recovery program to deal with the consequences of a fire of that nature. I think an additional frustration is that that these weren't managed properly in the first place. And I'd like to kind of talk for a minute about the difference between prevention and preparation. And I think we've touched on some of all of that here in our discussion today. And I'd like to talk about these category exclusions. And Ms. Hiromi, maybe you could address the USDA's and DOA's proposal to speed up prevention and hazardous fuels fires through using those categorical exclusions, and tell us a little bit about those, if you would.
Congressman, for using the categorical exclusion that you provided for us. And let me back up and say thank you for the fire funding fix as well. We truly appreciate that. We're seeing use already in the CE that you provided us, especially for hazardous fuels in insects and disease-ridden areas. And so we're getting good traction on being able to use that tool.
Good, thank you. Supervisor Veerkamp, in your written testimony, you said property ownership is a responsibility. That sounds like an local elected official, because I think, having been a mayor before, I would understand that. The federal government owns over 630 million acres, and as you've said, that comes with responsibility. In some of my counties in my district, it's 60, 70, 80, 90% federal land. How would you, if you had a magic wand as a local elected official, how would you have the federal government respond in that ownership responsibility?
Very good question, very good point, and I sort of breezed right over that. We have the same situation in El Dorado County. 70-ish plus % is federal lands, whether it's BLM or U.S. Forest Service. Through the cohesive strategy out of the FLAME Act, we are working with our partner very well. Very slow in response, because the FLAME Act, as you know, was 2009, and we're in 2019, finally making some progress. But we need more help there. I think the Forest Service needs more help there. The funding has not been there. We've designed a whole list of projects, and we're carrying those out, but more from grants from the Mule Deer Foundation, the National Turkey Foundation, than the money that's available through the Forest Service to manage our public lands. So it certainly is an issue. We're collaborating very well, but the constant we hear back is hands are tied either to regulation or lack of money.
Ironically, I think some of the arguments that's used in not giving that federal land to the states is that they wouldn't take care of it. And I think states are frustrated with that argument. I'd like to, just in my remaining few seconds, point out that, that I am a co-sponsor of Mr. Westerman's Resilient Federal Forest Act, which I believe shows that active management and federal land management doesn't need to mean that we sacrifice environmental concerns. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. The chair recognizes Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses and the members. We have the potential of a really productive, thoughtful policy conversation breaking out in this committee, and that doesn't happen all the time. So congratulations to the chair and ranking member. We'll need to resist the temptations that creep into these conversations. On my side of the aisle, it's of course tempting in moments like this to scream in exasperation about our colleagues across the aisle not understanding the role of climate change in this conversation. We should just have that conversation separately. And on the other side, I think the notion that creeps in that we're going to somehow log and clear-cut our way to fire safety likewise is a talking point and not a serious policy conversation. If we can resist those centrifugal forces, we might be able to identify some real thoughtful solutions here involving what seems to me are the two aspects of this problem. Mr. Curtis characterized it as prevention versus preparation. I was thinking of it, as I listened to your testimony, as the spread of these fires and the survivability of these fires once they come into the wildland-urban interface. But either way, there's sort of two pieces to this problem. And it's a slightly different conversation depending on what piece you're talking about. So on the forest health and the way these fires spread, or as Mr. Curtis characterized it, the prevention side. Mr. Bay, you talked about some successful collaborations, And I, too, have seen the good work that can be done through collaboratives in my district, and proud to represent the Karuk tribe and some other interests in some of the examples you talked about. But I've also seen examples where a collaborative in my district represents two different Forest Service units. And in one of the units, the work is moving forward, and in the other unit, it's not. Year after year after year. There's some kind of an institutional roadblock that is in the culture of one unit of the fire service, and there's all kinds of innovative leadership moving things forward in another unit. It's not the environmental laws, it's not the conditions on the ground. Can you speak to that ingredient in the success of a good collaborative actually producing results on the ground? Have you encountered similar differences?
I haven't encountered the differences on more of the bottleneck side you're talking about. And, we've been operating, under fully legal NEPA-ized projects, but front-loading those projects ahead of time, investing several years in communications with all sides of the issue toward a win-win project. So that's, I guess I've seen that occur. Things sometimes do move slow, but it's that ability to compromise. And like you just mentioned here, with this body, it's real similar. We're talking about all lands, all hands. We're talking about giving in on each side to come up with a good end result. So also front-loading the NEPA, the community conversation, investing in that co-investment in those conversations to get a good project off the ground. Sometimes it does take several years. But in the end, when you look at just in Oregon alone, $500 million in wildland fire suppression cost in 2018, it's worth that investment. It's worth that investment from programs like state and private forestry and our tribal partners contributing $93,638 to the initiative. National Forest Foundation's collaborative capacity funding. In our state, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board's focus.
You've done great work on those collaboratives, and I want to learn more about it because we have to find a way to replicate the success of those collaboratives. Ms. Hiromi, if you're wondering, scratching your head, wondering what I'm talking about, take a look at the difference in track record between the Shasta-Trinity and the Six Rivers National Forests, both of which are involved in the Trinity Collaborative in the northern part of my district, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about and why it's been so frustrating for that. For many in that collaborative. So on the survivability side of this, Mr. Quarles, you talked a lot about building materials and best practices and defensible space. But from the lessons of the North Bay firestorm, I know that even some of the best practices can't prevent some structures from burning. We saw some examples where homeowners had done all the right things and those homes still went up, and others seemingly had terrible practices and just by virtue of the whims of the wind and the conditions, they were spared. Evacuation plans have to be part of this conversation too, and I realize I'm out of time, but at some point I would love to hear some of the witnesses talk about that part of preparedness and survivability.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Gohmert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the witnesses' testimony today. I had noticed that in other testimony from State Forester and Director of Texas A&M Forest Service, testimony in 2018, it was pointed out that in 2017, the top 8 states in terms of numbers of acres of prescribed fire carried out were in the South, which included state of Texas. And I noticed from an article, July 30th, 2018, that if you go back to the very beginning of photography in California, hundreds of landscape photos from the dawn of photography with photos taken from the same location 100 years later or more. The difference was amazing. In the 1850s and 60s, The typical Sierra landscape was of open fields of grass, punctuated by isolated pine stands and a few scattered oak trees. The first branches on the pine trees started about 20 feet up, lower branches having been burned off by low-intensity grass fires. California's Native American population had for years shaped this landscape with fire to encourage the grasslands and boost the game animal population. But it's amazing, since the management has been so restricted by regulations, particularly in California, regardless of the effects or lack thereof of carbon dioxide emissions, which actually encourages growth of plants and trees that use photosynthesis. It appears, and I know some want to deny it, but that proper management, the way Native Americans did, is actually a helpful thing, instead of just allowing trees to grow unimpeded, avoiding fire breaks, avoiding getting rid of undergrowth. Mr. Veerkamp, I'm curious, do you see that a better management program in California of particularly federal forests would make a difference in reducing the fires, the intensity, and the numbers of acres?
Well, yes, sir, absolutely. But it also is going to take this coordinated effort of fires burned from the forests into the communities,
Right,
and from the communities out. And that's why the cohesive strategy is so important, that we work together to solve those issues. The Forest Service, again, has been very collaborative. BLM, not so. We're finally getting some help from them. They own a lot of land in El Dorado County, or public land, and they just have never had, so they've said, resources to help us with those in very highly populated areas, the Cameron Park, just east of Sacramento areas. So absolutely, we can do much better in the forest, and that doesn't mean that we're gonna clear cut everything at all. We just have to manage them, and that was done, I think.
and would you define what you mean by management?
Well, that's a combination of selective thinning, logging, taking out invasive trees, lodgepole pine and so forth that is choking all of our meadows. And again, this is where the Native Americans and our ancestors, as they left the mountains in the summer, followed the practices that they learned, and they went back in the spring to very nice lush meadows and areas where they could graze cattle, and it was better for everything, including the environment.
In the 30 seconds we've got left, you said, you mentioned Native Americans followed what they had learned. What was it they learned?
They learned that proper management paid huge dividends, and I don't think
What was the proper management?
Proper
Having
management.
grass fires, thinning forests?
Very low intensity fire, because they didn't have the debris buildup that we have today that becomes catastrophic. One other quick element is water. We don't have plentiful, affordable water in these areas that burn today. Are very hot and dry by the time we get to August, September, October, and maybe even different times of the year. We've not placed enough emphasis on water supply either. And our elder Americans can't afford water anymore because it's too expensive. And guess what? 1 more, 2 more, 3 more degrees of humidity and percentage of humidity, and we've got more problems.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gomer. The chair recognizes Ms. DeGette.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for holding today's hearing. I know our witnesses here are mostly from the West Coast, but of course Colorado has enormous issues with wildfires as well. And we have thousands of residents who are living in communities that are in close proximity to high fire areas. And of course, we've had some devastating forest fires that have gone into the urban interface. One of the issues that actually Supervisor Veerkamp raised just briefly in his opening remarks is an issue that in urban areas like my district of Denver that we're having to think about is what do we do about water supplies and watershed conditions. Denver is a very large urban center, but we get all of our water from the mountains, and we've had situations with some of these devastating wildfires where the watershed has been compromised. So I want to talk about a program that's been implemented in Denver. When we had the 1996 Buffalo Creek and the 2002 Hayman wildfires, they were at extreme high intensity in the watershed right around the Strontia Springs Reservoir, which is one of the major sources of water to Denver. And the damage that was caused to the Denver water collection system was over $27 million in restoration and repair. So in response to that, the Denver Water Agency and the U.S. Forest Service entered into a partnership. And the program's been so successful that now the program was expanded in 2017 to include the Colorado State Forest Service and the Natural Resources Conservation Services. And I know, Ms. Hiromi, you know about this program, the U.S. Forest Service Partnership, Shared Stewardship Strategy, and the National Cohesive Wild Management Strategy. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that's working?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for recognizing that wonderful work that we're doing with Denver Water and other partners. The Forest Service manages lands that are the sources of drinking water for 60 million Americans every day. And of course, the Denver Watershed and the water that we provide for the municipalities in that area is extremely important. We are proud to be in that partnership. You're aware also that a project that we did with Denver Water as part of that Forest to Faucets program actually was a project near Silverthorne, and we did it a number of years ago. The project was designed to be protect the community as well as to protect the watershed. And last June, we had a success in that wildfire started, and that area that was managed we were able to be aggressive in our firefighting, have our firefighters be safe, and no home was lost in that.
That's right, and the watershed was protected. Do you think we can extrapolate this to other areas in the country?
Absolutely. Okay. I would hope that we would use this as a model, as a learning tool as we go forward with a number of partners.
Let me just ask you, Dr. Rasker, why is it so important to implement pre-fire mitigation practices like these?
Pardon me. For a lot of communities, they realize the fires are coming, regardless of what we do, right? I mean, and so what the communities that apply to our program, what they're interested in is how can they put in place, requirements for example, landscape treatments on private property, flame retardant building materials, that sort of thing. So, for example, we worked in Summit County, Colorado. It's the first community we worked with, and there was quite a turnaround there. At first, they had a requirement to plant mature trees and bushes immediately next to the house, which is an effort to hide the homes, right? So this is in Breckenridge.
Right.
And by the time we were done, they changed that around, their paradigm shift, and they basically said, no, we now need to inspect properties and have defensible space around homes.
And it worked last year when they had that fire.
It sure did.
Yeah. Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. DeGette. Chair recognizes Mr. Cook for 5 minutes. The chair recognizes Mr. Falter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a statement to Ms. Hiromi. You listed some statistics that they appear to be dead on. Just for the record, in my home state of Idaho, in 2018, we had 1,132 fires, and that was about 605,000 acres for us. So it's a big deal for us, and it's something that we fight on a regular basis, and just appreciate you being here. Mr. Veerkamp, you had mentioned, among other things, that you'd come to our state a lot as a tourist, and we want you to come back. Keep spending money. We need it. A lot of your colleagues from California aren't going home. We've got fastest growing population in the country right now, and that's to a large extent because of California. Since the 1970s in our state, the economy has gradually shifted from one that's predominantly resource-based to one that is more service-based. And to a large extent, the reason for that has been the reduction of active, organized timber harvests, grazing, mining, and so on. And Mr. Veerkamp, you had said at, I think at one point in time that you believe that active harvest and wise management and grazing was one of the best mechanisms to prevent these catastrophic fires. Did I understand that correctly?
That is correct. It certainly plays in the toolbox.
So another issue, and we're segueing a little bit, and so if this is outside your wheelhouse, just let me know. But another factor that's had such an impact on our state and economy has been the lawsuits that have been filed many times by entities or individuals who've never even been to our state that have slowed the process down for permitting or for activity in one form or another. And I was honored to become a co-sponsor of Mr. Westerman's bill on resilient forests. And one of the components in that bill has to do with how those conflicts may be handled. And arbitration with a pilot program for arbitration where there's a requirement that those who are taking issue with how things are being done or the application need to come forward with a solution. Again, this may be out of your wheelhouse, but I just open it up to see if you've got a comment on that.
I think as Congressman McClintock can attest, El Dorado County is a pretty good hotbed for lawsuits when it comes to CEQA and NEPA and processes just on building residences, let alone going into the forest. I think there's ability to compromise, but there's got to be some common sense applied also that if the thing we're going after is going to ruin the environment, which we've seen now time after time with these catastrophic incidents, then we can prove scientifically that what the assertion is way more damaging than what the consequences may be. And I may have that backwards, but so we've just got to come to some commonality there. I don't think any of us are not talking that language, and I don't think any of you aren't either. But we got to just be a little bit realistic in what the outcomes are and what the outcomes now have shown us, and not only to the environment, but to people. And we got to put people first. We got to put public safety first. And there's multiple tools that we've mentioned here today that we can work towards and simplifying that process when the benefit is so big here to our people. And I've been in your state compared to our state, hunting and doing other things where they're still cattle grazing and they're doing things in the high country. And it's a world of difference. And the wildlife is plentiful, and also they can get through it. And it's
So just thank you for that, and I'm about to run out of time, so I want to ask another question. But I want to thank you. I want to thank the panel for what you do. As Mr. Huffman said, we're dangerously close to having a lot of commonality on this, and this is a huge deal for our state. And I appreciate Madam Chair for orchestrating the panel and colleagues for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Neguse for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Curtis, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to the panel for your testimony today. I represent Colorado's 2nd Congressional District. It's northern Colorado up to the Wyoming border, Larimer County, Fort Collins, and much of our central mountains, so Summit County and Eagle County. places like Vail and Breckenridge, Frisco, and many other towns and cities. And wildfires, as I'm sure the panel is well aware, are certainly a major threat to my home state of Colorado and to a number of the communities in my district in particular. Last year, 1,249 wildfires burned a near record 524,000 acres, 5 times the annual average. And not only are we seeing an increased incidence of wildfires, they are also increasing in intensity and in cost. And adding to this threat, in particular in my state, is the widespread bark beetle infestation. In Colorado alone, the mountain pine beetle has killed 3.4 million acres, and spruce beetle has killed 1 million acres to date. And the resulting dead needles and trees will only increase the intensity of the wildfires, as I know the panel is aware. And the most intense beetle kill is in Rocky Mountain National Park, which also happens to be in my district. Finally, I'll just say for the record, the cost of wildfires really is staggering. In 2018, Colorado spent $40 million. The U.S. Forest Service, of course, spent $120 million on wildfires in our state. That is 3 times what we spent at the federal level the year before. And so I think those statistics are certainly sobering and highlight why this hearing is, of course, so important. Ms. Hiromi, I wanted to start with you. I first want to thank you for being here today. And of course, I want to thank you for your service as a former firefighter and for your testimony. You mentioned in your testimony that 9 out of the 10 wildfires, or on average, are caused by humans. It was in your written testimony, I believe. And I appreciated your comments as I reviewed your testimony on improving our wildfire education and engaging communities to make sure they are prepared. I guess in your opinion, do you think that right now the Forest Service is doing enough to make sure that communities are educated, informed, and prepared?
I don't think we, and the corporate we, it takes all of us, Congressman, and thank you for recognizing that it takes a number of people and different programs and different venues to help not only homeowners, but landowners and everyone involved in this very difficult situation to be able to come together for some solution.
Thank you. One thing one item I've certainly mentioned in hearings before, some of my colleagues are probably getting tired of hearing me talk about it, but there's a particular issue in my district, and I suspect it's actually prevalent around many other districts across the country. Counties in my district have essentially been forced to provide the funds to hire, train, and deploy dispersed recreation crews for the purposes of fire prevention, education, and providing campsite monitoring. And that's a direct byproduct of the inability of the Forest Service to provide the adequate resources to carry out those functions. And so I believe, a hearing a few weeks ago, had the opportunity to talk with the acting forest chief about that particular issue. I would certainly like to work with you and with your team, and I hope you all are open to that. I've sent a letter to the Forest Chief Director in that regard to make sure that financial burden isn't being, forced onto counties and local towns and cities when this is really a federal obligation. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that matter, but.
Thank you. We do recognize that recreation is a very valuable use of the national forest lands, and people want to recreate in healthy forests. And to have healthy forests, we need to manage some of the wildfires. Happy to work with you.
Thank you. The last question I have is, there are a variety of communities in my district that are frustrated at their inability to be able to institute fire bans in the federally protected lands when they are able to do so on state public lands, right, in a more expedited fashion. And that is to say, if a local community would like to move forward with banning, fire, right, at an earlier stage because of the potential threat, I think there is a desire for to have a willingness on the part of the Forest Service, to work in conjunction with those local communities to enable them to do that at a quicker rate. And I am curious about whether you all would be open to that.
Thank you, Congressman. Absolutely, we would be open to that as well.
Thank you. We'll certainly follow up, and with that, I yield back. And thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. The chair recognizes Mr. McClintock.
Madam Chairman, I think you would all agree that we've seen a very dramatic increase in catastrophic wildfire in recent years. Is there any dissent from that observation? The reason I ask is I went back through the numbers, and it really is quite staggering. During the last half of the 20th century, in California, we lost about 250,000 acres a year to catastrophic wildfire. Last year, we lost about 1.5 million acres to catastrophic fire, so that's a six-fold increase. And we started talking about the new normal or the new abnormal. But I went back and looked, and it turns out in pre-Columbian times, scientists estimate that we lost between 4.5 million and 12 million acres to catastrophic wildfire every year in California, of a huge amount of destruction every year. The Campfire that decimated Congressman LaMalfa's district, destroyed the town of Paradise, hit 153,000 acres, just that single fire. And of course, that shocks our sensibilities today, but in 1910, the big burn that took out major parts of Montana and Idaho destroyed 3 million acres, 7 towns, and killed 87 people in a much sparser population. So something happened, and I think that something, Ms. Hiromi, was the U.S. Forest Service. At the turn of the last century, we began to realize that an untended forest is just like an untended garden. If it's left alone, it will grow until it chokes itself to death. And nature's way of managing untended forests is pretty brutal. It's catastrophic disease, pestilence, drought, and ultimately catastrophic wildfire. So we began managing our forests. We began taking out excess timber before it burns. There's an old saying, excess timber will come out of the forest one way or the other. It's either carried out or it burns out, but it does come out. And it was that modern forest management, active scientific management of our forests, that brought down the destruction to a mere fraction of what it was in pre-Columbian times. And then something happened again. And I'm afraid that was in the 1970s when we began placing impediments to the ability of the Forest Service to actively manage our land. Ms. Hiromi, haven't we seen about an 80% decline in timber harvested off of the federal lands since 1980?
Congressman, actually, last year we had one of our higher years.
No, I understand that. It's starting to come back up again, but it's still about an 80% decline, isn't it, from the 1980 levels?
Yes, sir, we are lower than where we were.
We're lower or much lower?
I don't have the numbers exactly. I can get back to you.
Well, I'd like to ask you to look at those numbers, because I think you will find that it is quite dramatic. Didn't the U.S. Forest Service used to generate money from sale of excess timber for the federal treasury?
Yes, sir, we still do.
Now, you still generate net revenues or gross revenues? It used to be gross revenues. And 25% of those revenues went directly to local communities like El Dorado County, didn't it, Supervisor Veerkamp?
Yes, that's true.
Are you still getting a large revenue stream from auctions of federal timber?
Very minimal.
Why is that?
Then the decline in timber.
Decline in timber and also costs of doing the studies for timber.
That's exactly right, in the years it takes to get through the processes. Yes, sir.
Ms. Hiromi, we got a 10,000-acre categorical exclusion for forest thinning projects in the Tahoe Basin in the Tahoe Restoration Act. The manager of the Tahoe Basin Management Unit tells me that has taken the environmental assessments from more than 400 pages down to less than 40 pages and has expedited the review process from years down to 4 months. How's that working out there?
We're using every tool that you are providing us, Congressman.
How is that particular tool working?
Certainly, I'm not familiar with the tool in the basin. I'm familiar with other tools that you've given us that we're using.
Supervisor Veerkamp, in the remaining moments, could you tell, what do we need most to do to help you defend your community?
We need help like that. Supervisor Novacell's here right now. She represents the Basin, and she could certainly tell you, and I know from our discussions, it's working very well. We started probably 10 years ago in the Basin with a lot of attention, basically when the Angora fire, and it's working very well. Thank you guys for that. But there's a lot more to do, and that's again, we need to be able to move more quickly, especially with the bark beetle infestation in California and other states.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I call the next member to ask questions, I'd like to submit for the record proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences long-term perspective on wildfires in the western United States. And now I will call Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our panel for being here. My home state of Georgia has an unparalleled combination of wood resources, processing industries, market access, and transportation. As of December 2016, there were 190 primary wood product manufacturing facilities located in Georgia that convert logs to valuable products, including 12 pulp mills, 8 panel and engineered wood product mills, 97 sawmills, and 73 other mills. Most of Georgia's forest products come from state and private forests, where only 4% of our state is federally owned. I understand that many western states with significant amounts of federal land, mills and other processing facilities have been shutting down for decades. Ms. Hiromi, my question for you is, are there lessons to be learned from the management of these state and private forests that we should be applying to our national forests?
Congressman, we know that the infrastructure is a vital component of this spectrum that I talked about earlier to be able to treat and manage national forests.
Mr. Veerkamp, would you add anything?
We were at an all-time high, probably half a dozen or more mills. We have 0, and it's really hurt the local economy of a rural area.
So you would say there are lessons that need to be learned?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And Madam Chairman, I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Mr. Westerman.
I'd like to thank the gentleman from Georgia for yielding. Georgia really is a great example of how forests can be healthy, the benefit of working forest, and where I think in general the population there, as well as many other states in the South, understand the myriad of benefits in forest management. I was excited just a week or two ago to sit down with a gentleman from the Georgia Forestry Association and show me a project they're doing with public schools and with the Georgia Public Broadcasting to actually create a virtual reality science lessons that the schools are implementing. I think they've reached about 1.2 million students in Georgia, so hats off to your state. As we think about the hearing today, I want to, some people may not understand the way the protocol for these meetings works is the majority side gets to pick most of the witnesses, the minority side usually gets to pick one witness. This is a subject area that's very near and dear to me, so I want the witnesses to know that I personally read every word of your testimony, and there was something very glaring in that testimony to me. And I say this as a member of the committee and also as someone who actually went to graduate school in forestry. I took licensed forester exams, and I've been licensed in a couple of states to actually practice forestry. And the glaring thing that was in this testimony is that had I just read the testimony without the names or anything else on it, I couldn't have picked out the Democratic witnesses or the Republican witness. I want to thank you all for your testimony. I want to thank whoever set the panel up. This is one of the best works of testimony that I've seen when you put all of it together across the board. And I would say that I probably agree with 95% or more of everything in everyone's testimony, and that's fantastic when you consider that I probably don't agree with my wife and kids that much. So hats off to all of you. As we look at the the testimony and the ideas I had to talk about wildfire here today. The video from the Insurance Institute. I was actually going to have that video play, but you already had it in your testimony. That's absolutely true. There's things we can do to make our structures, homes, businesses, infrastructure more fire resilient in the wildland-urban interface. And that's an area we need to focus on more. So Dr. Rasker and Dr. Quarles, thank you for looking at that important component. Mr. Bay, your testimony, your written testimony is fantastic. And there's even a paragraph in there that I highlighted that I wanted to read back to the committee, because this may be the most salient thing I've ever heard a witness say about what's going on with our forest and how we need to address that. But on page, well, I don't have the page number, but it just says there is a practical solution. That's important right there. There is a practical solution to these problems. Through science-based risk assessments and land management strategies, there is a middle way between complete hands-off. Oh, I yield back.
You'll have more time coming up. Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Chair now recognizes Mr. Horsford.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairwoman for organizing today's hearing on the challenges faced from wildfires and the steps communities are taking to prepare for wildfires. Wildfire resiliency is an issue of significant importance to my constituents, many of whose livelihoods, ranches, and homes depend on proper wildlife preparedness. According to the U.S. Forest Service Wildlife Fire Assessment done just yesterday, the majority of the state of Nevada is currently at moderate risk to fire danger. Alarmingly, a significant portion of my state includes areas in my district which are classified as high risk. As summer begins and temperatures increase, fire danger will increase throughout Nevada and much of the West. To make the problem worse, climate change is currently adding to the threat faced by wildfires, particularly in Nevada, where temperatures are soaring, water is becoming scarce, and invasive species like sheetgrass are adding to full loads. According to the state's at-risk report card, which is an assessment of America's preparedness for wildfires, the growing threat from wildfires is concentrated in 4 states: Nevada, Texas, California, Arizona, where more than 35 million people live in the high threat zone, known as the wildland-urban interface. The report also found that Nevada, Texas, and Arizona, along with many other states, have done little to prepare for future climate change-driven threats to wildfires, leaving millions living in the wildland-urban interface, including many Nevadans, in considerable danger. So these stats are alarming, and it's why we've got to tackle the problem. So Dr. Quarles, I'd like to ask you, California is leading the way in efforts to prepare for wildfires, develop wildfire resilient communities, and mitigate the increasing risk faced by climate change. How can Nevada better prepare for growing fuel loads and wildfire impacts exacerbated by climate change?
Well, I mean, the step that I could address would be related to building codes related to home resiliency, home resistance, or reducing home vulnerabilities. I know that in northern Nevada, they have taken a lot of steps to develop and approve building codes for new construction. I think one thing that it's important to understand is that building codes really apply to new construction, and I'm pretty sure that all of us already live someplace. And so ways to reduce the vulnerability of existing homes, existing buildings is important, and really, unless you have some sort of significant remodel language related to remodeling, there's no particular way to make a homeowner do anything. So you have to provide some way to incentivize changes to their homes in order to make them equally resistant to wildland fire. So that would, one thing would be a way to address existing infrastructure.
Thank you. Mr. Bay, you have direct experience showing how restoration projects can reduce fuel loads and build community preparedness. Can the federal government save money in the long run by investing in ecosystem restoration projects?
Well, I think the answer would be yes, not being an economist. But a couple of quick examples are 3 locations over the last couple years where we've put restorative fuels treatments, and fire has come into those locations, and fire has stayed on the ground, not gone up into the crowns of trees. One was an All Lands initiative that the landowner was able to get up there and put the fire out post-treatment. Another was on federal lands from a lightning strike in the Rogue River Siskiyou, where fire stayed on the ground in a stand that had been previously treated. So just by those grassroots, place-based, on-the-ground examples, it appears that would be the case.
Can you also explain how the federal government can cooperate with Native American tribes to help prepare reservations and communities for wildfires?
Well, to answer that, based on the delegation who's given me some respect to speak on that, it appears more co-investments in the Good Neighbor Authority and with some of the recent authority shifts to continue to build capacity and support tribal communities in building workforces and working across all lands.
Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I regret getting cut off earlier. I was just going to talk about the statement in Mr. Bay's testimony that I wanted to read back. And he said, there's a practical solution through science-based risk assessments and land management strategies. There is a middle way between a complete hands-off approach or the do-nothing approach and outdated forest management practices of extensive timber harvests that have created homogenized landscapes, making them prone to burning hotter. This middle road strategy protects large trees and wildlife habitat, conducts ecologically based commercial thinning of trees as the byproduct of restorative work, and reduces the risk to communities by returning beneficial fire to the landscape. I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you for that testimony. That's you conveyed the message that I've been trying to say since I've been on this committee, and I know you've seen this work in the field. Some words that you use in there, the do-nothing approach. When we do nothing, when we make the decision not to manage our forest, we made a management decision. We have to know that the forest doesn't care what policy we make here. They continue to grow and fill the growing space, and a no decision is a management decision. Also, I want to point out using the word of commercial thinning. One of the biggest mistakes I think we made is to think that it's wrong to do commercial thinning. Pre-commercial thinning is a cost with very little return to it. Commercial thinning allows you to recapture some of the cost of moving that crew into the woods, and it also makes the forest healthier. Now, you talked about patch thinning and different ways to do it, but we need to have the flexibility to do commercial thinning. Forests are different all across the country. This photo up here is from federal land in my state. This is not national forest, but it's Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge. That may look like a healthy forest to some, but that's a control area, and there's not much biodiversity in there. Right conditions, that's subject to wildfire, catastrophic wildfire, and it's the control site. If you look at the next slide, the management regime is to go in and commercially thin, leave the big trees, leave different species of trees, and then to burn underneath. In the third slide, that's what it looks like when you're through. And those grasses that are coming up, those are seeds that have been in the soil for centuries, or not centuries, but decades. And they flush and they create great wildlife habitat. The plant and animal biodiversity is greater in that forest much greater than the one we first saw. And the amount of wildlife, turkey, deer, quail, and this is actually red-cockaded woodpecker habitat, which is an endangered species. So your approach works. It would look different in different states because forests are different, but that's not clear cutting, and that's creating a good fire break. Ms. Hiromi, in your testimony, and thank you for what the Forest Service is doing to utilize the authorities that are there and the new authorities through Good Neighbor and hopefully the stewardship contracting. One thing that I think we can focus on more is the wildland-urban interface, and we should fund state and private forestry at higher levels because that's preventative medicine right there to allow, because a lot of the land in the WUI is not federal land. It's privately owned land, sometimes small woodlot owners that have no incentive to go in and manage those woodlots. I would like to look at the next slide. This is a map of the WUIs across the country. You can see most of them are in the east because there's higher population density. The areas subject to have the worst fires are in the west. Let's go to the next slide. This is a slide that may not mean much to you, but this is the Campfire, and if you see the red hatched area, that is the boundary of the Campfire, so that dark red line is where the fire stopped. That blue line is land owned by Sierra Pacific, a private company in California, and you can see the fire stopped on their property. And if you look closer, there's a light green hatched line. That's actually where a timber company put in a fire break. If we look at the next slide, that's what that fire break looked like. It wasn't a clear cut, it was where the forest had been thinned and the underbrush taken out. So again, thank you all. I think if we implemented what you're talking about 30 or 40 years ago, we wouldn't be having a lot of the discussions we're having today. And if we can get good policy in place, 40 or 50 years from now, things will be a lot better. I yield back.
Mr. Westerman. Chair recognizes Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to sit in on the committee today where my heart's been for a long time, and I appreciate it. A lot has been said about the Campfire as kind of the worst example of what has happened in the fire danger and the fire devastation, not just in the West, but acknowledging Gatlinburg. It can happen pretty much anywhere in the country over the last years. 2018, depending on your stats, maybe the worst fire season on record, but whoever's had it happen in their district, that's the worst fire season on record for them, on these devastating, whether devastating to communities, to hundreds of thousands of acres. My own area last year, 650,000 acres, and even more so, we lost 93 people perished in the two different wildfires, the Campfire in the Paradise area and the Car Fire in the area of Redding, California, which was its own horrendous happening. And I want to thank the people in this room and those that are watching and those that have helped and weighed in on the Campfire, especially the people of Paradise, and all the support that has come in, whether through policy, through appropriations, and the outpouring for the people there. So many people have sent donations and their time and labor and all that to help the people recover. And Paradise and the surrounding areas, Magalia, Concal, Yankee Hill, all those areas, they're on the way back. They're resilient is a key word, and they're bouncing back. We're going to have a graduation of Paradise High School on their campus in June, which is kind of a landmark for those students who have been displaced in temporary buildings all this year and such. So it's been a pretty good phoenix rising from all that as we still struggle to move along. So thank you all on that. The issue kind of boils down to, when we look at a recent briefing showed that you have three components that make up the fire environment. Only one you can control. The three components, fuel, weather, and topography, we can do things about fuel. And so as we move forward, having learned these lessons again, and we learn them harder and harder, that the wildland-urban interface, we need to rethink what that looks like with forest thinning around communities, buffer zones, fire breaks like that. And I hope that's something that's contained in the Westerman bill and his efforts on that resilience. The areas within the communities, how many trees can we have? The defensible space around homes. Paradise is going to look a lot different for at least the next 50 years. So but what are the lessons we're going to learn? And then finally, as we've talked about several times in committee, the buildings that we rebuild or the new buildings that we put up in these so susceptible communities, what quality are they going to be with burn-resistant materials, the vents, the things that all cause, and you can see with these fires, there's a certain amount of randomness as to which homes burn, and they may not necessarily be built a particular way. I saw it in Reading, random, hopscotch, the homes that were burnt there on the west side of Reading, and to an extent in Paradise, though 90% of them are gone. What can we do? We can do things to decrease the odds. We'll never prevent fires, but we can decrease the odds and we can make them more fightable with the steps we take in buffer zones, in fire breaks, in defensible space. So what I'd like to hear from the panel is a couple things, is that for Mr. Hiromi, at the pace of 1% to 2% per year of treatment of Forest Service lands, and the fuel loads we're seeing, and with a nod to Mr. Huffman here, we're talking about, if we're going to talk about climate change, we're going to talk about drought, if we're talking about change in cycles, whatever it is, man-made, not man-made, we have some different conditions, and we have to have a different inventory per acre of trees to survive drought, to have the trees have the amount of trees per acre that are sustainable. How can the Forest Service catch up at 1% to 2% per year of what we have to do to ensure forest health, forest safety, and the communities that might be around them?
We know that, Congressman, thank you. We know that we need to be more assertive in our partnerships. We also know that fire behaviors are requiring bigger landscape level treatments. The smaller treatments that we're doing in the past can't stand up in many places to the fires that we're seeing. And so we're looking at landscape level, meaning not just 1 or 2 counties. We're looking at 3 or 4 counties to be able to help that make a difference on the ground.
Nationally, it's a big number that we need, though.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
May I ask your indulgence, Madam Speaker, or Madam Chairman, for one more question of Mr. Veerkamp?
Okay.
I greatly appreciate it.
Okay.
A very important component, for example, on rebuilding Paradise, is how are homes or businesses, buildings going to be insurable? People are pulling out of writing insurance in these more risky communities, and I think you may have an insight, Supervisor, in your area. How in the world are we going to get someone to want to, what criteria will we have to build in with thinning or fire breaks or defensible space or the type of building materials? What are we going to do to get the confidence back of insurance companies to want to come in and write fire insurance in non-burned or rebuilt communities? How are we going to do that?
I believe it's going to take this hard work we're working on. Even with the county's ordinance now, they've basically said, well, okay, we'll have to wait and see, but they won't automatically go back to giving insurance. Western end of the county, lowland and different stuff where there's just not the vegetation, it's fine, but we're losing insured right and left, and it's starting to hurt now, the home prices, real estate market.
Land
so
values,
forth.
yes, sir, the whole thing. Yeah.
That's why this work is so important, and we have now stepped it up, and we've got to make fire-safe and resilient communities. And I studied the Bel Air fire and other fires of a long time ago in Southern California. You got to keep that vegetation away from those homes, too. You can have very, very resilient home structures, but if you put all that flammable vegetation that dries out, and you get a little bit of wind, it's a blowtorch, and that the best house in the world isn't going to withstand what happens.
You're correct. It's a key component towards rebuilding anything.
Thank you.
Because the insurability is just almost out the window. Thank you for your indulgence for the
You're
time today,
welcome,
Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Lamont.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you. Thank you. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I'll start with Dr. Rasker. Forest Service research and other studies have shown that the most effective way to protect structures and communities from wildfire is to create defensible spaces and install fire-wise retrofits. What are the biggest challenges preventing more communities from completing wildfire hazard assessments and ensuring homeowner participation?
Thank you for that question. There's several pinch points, several places where people need more help. Neighborhood scale hazard mapping is very useful, but the ability to provide that for communities is limited. These maps help identify areas where there's high risk and also areas that are not at risk, where it's perfectly okay to build as much as you'd like. We find that planners, people who are in that profession, have never, during their years in school, been exposed to issues related to wildfire. We also find that fire departments are never, those staff are never exposed to issues related to land use planning. So one of the things we've done is brought the planning department and the fire department to work together collaboratively with local government. So that's more assistance, more land use planning help. These planning departments are full-on busy. Now you come in and say, now you need to plan for wildfire. They need help getting that done. And they need help with hazard maps.
Next question, Mr. Rasker. What is needed to scale up a program like Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, CPAW?
There are more and more land use planners who are getting good at wildfire. We work with Wildfire Planning International, and they in turn have identified quite a few people around the country who are getting pretty good at this. We've got one person on staff, for example, in Bend, Oregon, who participated in our program and is now working to help other communities in Oregon. And we have people identified in Montana. So more people working in more places. I think we can do a better job with training, more planners to be good at wildfire issues. We can engage the firefighting departments more. I think a lot of training for fire departments on what a land use planning code looks like and how to enforce it. Because oftentimes, when a code is passed by a city planning department, it works better if the enforcement of the code is done by somebody in uniform. Fire departments are well trusted. So those are some of the ideas.
Thank you, thank you. And last question is, what are the opportunities for the Forest Service to replicate the success of a program like CPAW? And are there other ways federal funds could better incentivize community land use planning and resilient construction, in your opinion?
So I think we should reward good land use planning where it exists. The good land use planning that we're seeing around wildfire doesn't just come from our program. The city of San Diego, Flagstaff, they've all done really good work on their own. Boulder, Colorado has done really good work on their own. I think as a profession, land use planning focused around reducing wildfire risk, that doesn't exist yet as a profession. There's just a scattering of people. So I think we should elevate it. We should have annual conferences. There should be a trade journal about this. There should be universities graduating people from planning departments specializing in wildfire. So I think we're getting there. I think we've got a critical mass going already.
Thank you so much for that insight. My last question, Dr. Quarles, how can improving community resilience reduce wildfire suppression costs for land management agencies? And is it fair to say that investing in community wildfire resiliency will pay off in the long run?
So your last question, I think the answer is yes. The complication just comes because many communities are already built, and it's this retrofitting, remodeling idea, and coupling vegetation and built environment kind of issues. So in the long run, it will, just because they'll be able to resist the wildland fire, but it has to be this community-wide effort if we're going to go down that path, and that does require other tools that can be in the toolkit. The home and the property is one, but as has already been spoken, other planning issues and community fuels management projects, both around, surrounding, and within the community are really important components.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank all of you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. I appreciate your valuable testimony and, of course, all of the good questions that were asked by our members. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for some of you or any of you, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing if you get them. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for the responses to come back. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.